Hello, welcome back to the Field of Screams. This week we will be talking about the movie Wreck, and we will be talking about the movie Quarantine. Now you might be thinking to yourself, why are we talking about two movies this week? Well, Wreck was made in Barcelona, Spain, and it became a huge hit in Europe. And whenever it became a huge hit, the US was like, well, we want to get in on this story too. This was a great movie. So they made a movie called Quarantine, which is basically a shot for shot remake of the movie Wreck. Now, when I say a shot for shot remake, there are some just subtle differences between the two movies, but it was mostly the same. It's the same story. They used a lot of the same dialogue, it's same plot. You could say it's the same, but there are some key differences if you want to be literal and matter of fact. There are some people out there, I think it's kind of almost a general consensus, that Wreck is the better movie just because creatively it was created first. If you're looking at Quarantine, you might say, well, there's not a creative bone in that movie's body, it was a remake. They're copying off of Wreck, and I get that. I myself, I watched Quarantine first. I thought it was fantastic. I just caught it one night, and I was like, Quarantine, I guess I'll watch like 10 minutes. And then I ended up loving the whole thing. I thought it was like one of the greatest scary movies ever. So I myself, if it wasn't for Quarantine, I probably never would have watched Wreck. So whenever I look at it, I am greatly appreciative of the movie Quarantine just for that reason. When it comes to sequels, it's a different story. But I myself, when it comes to the two, I think I prefer Quarantine, but I get why some people do not like Quarantine. I do think personally that Quarantine it has a cleaner shot to it. I know Quarantine has a bigger budget. Wreck was made on a $2 million budget, to whereas Quarantine was made on a $12 million budget. After watching Quarantine, I think I went about a year or maybe 2 years of not even knowing about the movie Wreck's existence. I recall going into the local video rental store, and I had rented Quarantine several times, and when the sequel Quarantine 2 came out, I was like, oh, cool. You know, they're going to continue this story, and I rented it, and it was a huge disappointment. Quarantine 2 is not even close to matching the quality of Quarantine 1. The guy who worked at the video rental place, he saw me rent Quarantine several times, and he asked me, he goes, well, how come you've never rented Wreck 2? And I said, well, I don't even know what Wreck is. I've never seen Wreck 1. And he goes, oh, you pretty much have. And then he kind of explained to me the whole business of Quarantine was basically a shot-for-shot remake of the movie Wreck. And I thought that was really interesting, and so I ended up with renting Wreck. And I stuck by my opinion. I favored Quarantine more, I think, just because I found it first. But when I watched Wreck 2, that movie was far superior than Quarantine 2 could even dream of. So Wreck has some very good things going for it, as I do think Quarantine does as well. So what I want to talk about here is I want to talk about the general story and plot of Quarantine and Wreck for those who haven't seen it. So we're about to go into spoiler territory in case you haven't seen it. So if you haven't seen it, click off now and watch a great movie. And after we talk about the plot of the two movies, we'll talk about kind of some of the subtle differences between the two, and then we can kind of talk about where the franchises went afterwards. So let's go ahead and get started. As I talk about the plot of the movie, I am going to be talking about the plot of Wreck, and not Quarantine. They are basically the same story. There are some subtle differences, but I feel like it's really unnecessary for me to explain the plot of Wreck and then start all over with the plot of Quarantine. So we will just be sticking with Wreck for right now. So the movie starts off with a news reporter named Angela Vidal at a fire station with her cameraman Pablo. Angela is played by Manuela Velasco, who is actually a Spanish TV hostess as well as an actress. The news program that Angelo and Pablo work for is called While You're Asleep. It basically comes off as a late night news program to where they interview and hang out with people of different occupations, and tonight Angelo and Pablo get to hang out with the firefighters. It's kind of a silly news name. One of the firemen even kind of cracks a joke saying, well, everyone's asleep, who's watching it? Hardy har har. So Angela and Pablo, they start bouncing around the fire station. Angela's doing her reporter gig, talking about the fire station, how long it takes everyone to get into the fire trucks, get started, get going, and this carries on for the first couple minutes of the film. The fire chief takes Angelo and Pablo, and he kind of tells the two firemen, Manuel and Alex, that Angelo and Pablo will be hanging around them tonight. If there's a call, they'll be traveling with them. And so, I mean, those are the two firemen that we get to know rather quickly. Now, in the Wreck trailer, when it first starts, it comes off as this intense film, and while it's going, there's these subtitles that pop up, and it's saying, you know, the emergency services attended 15,000 accidents, 4,200 fires, 4,000 rescues, and 6,768 other. And then the number kind of flickers and it says 6,769, indicating that this is going to be another other incident. But when Angela and Pablo are interviewing Alex the firefighter, they ask him, hey, what does a ordinary night look like? And he kind of just shrugs and he goes, you know, it's just kind of ordinary. About 70% of calls we get, so, you know, it's kind of nothing major. But don't worry, there is no false advertisement here. So once Angela interviews all the guys, she's kind of just walking around the station with Pablo. She's trying to make it exciting for the news program. And there's several times to where she looks at Pablo and she's kind of like, I just wish we could get a call. I wish something major could happen. No one get hurt, but I wish we could get called out there. Since Angela's bored and the firefighters really have nothing to do, they decide to play a little pickup basketball game. During this game, you could see that reporting is Angela's strong suit and not playing basketball. Towards the end of the game, Angela gets the basketball and travels by half a mile, jumps up in the air, comes back down with the ball, and then she throws up a shot and it goes in. All the firefighters kind of cheer. You know, they're good sports. They're not calling her out for the travel. If I was there, I probably would have called her out. No basket, our ball, back at the top. After Angela's LeBron James-like travel and victorious basket make, the sirens do go off and the firemen do get a call. Manu and Alex tell Angelo and Pablo to hop in the back of the fire truck and they head out towards the apartment where the call was made. When they arrive at the scene, all of the people that live in the apartment, they are standing in the lobby. Firefighters asking who made the call. They're trying to sort that out. Everyone's talking, kind of screaming. Everyone's kind of just worried. Finally, in the rush, one of the residents said that one of the residents that lives upstairs started screaming very loudly, and they were very worried and concerned, and they also made a point to state that the old lady was very weird. The police officer then comes downstairs and notices the firefighters and says, oh, okay, you guys are here. We need to go upstairs. We need to see what's going on in her apartment. And then he looks at Angelo and Pablo, and they're like, oh, what's a film crew doing here? And they kind of give them a lowdown of, oh, we're just here to document what's going on. And the police officer just kind of looks at the firefighters and he's like, well, they're your responsibility. You can tell he's not too thrilled that they are there. Before I go on into what happens next, I do think it's an interesting note that the two directors, it was co-directed, Jaime Balaguero, I probably butchered that, and Paco Plaza. They had the idea, well, they got inspiration from the Blair Witch Project, to where they gave the actors and actresses partial scripts so that they knew where their characters were going. They had lines of dialogue that they had to say to progress the story, but a lot of the actors or actresses did not know that they were going to die until the day of the shoot, usually. So that kind of raised the tension for the actors and actresses in this movie. Now at this point of the film, we have Pablo who's filming everyone going up the stairs. We have the two police officers leading the way. We have Manu and Alex walking behind the two police officers, and we have Angela who's walking behind them. As they are approaching the room, one of the police officers turns around and looks at Angela, and he's like, hey, just kind of stay out of the way. Probably shouldn't be filming. And Angela kind of snaps back, and she's like, well, we got the okay to be here, so... And then it's just kind of an awkward standoff, and the police officer kind of gives in. They're coming upon the room. One part that kind of made me laugh, because I could just feel how aggravated the police officers were getting. I think it was Pablo. He knocks over like a shelf and makes a really loud noise, and everyone they kind of like look back like, hey, you can be quiet. And then they keep walking again, and then Pablo kicks it again, and this time, like, even the firefighters turn around like, dude, what, stop, like, you're embarrassing us. They finally get to the room and they see the old lady standing in her apartment. She's covered with blood, and of course Pablo hits a button on his camera which activates the brights on his camera, which makes the old lady freak out even more. So now the police officers are almost trying to kick them out of the room, like, you guys are messing this all up. Out of the two police officers, there's one elder police officer and there's one younger cop. The elder cop approaches the old lady and he's trying to kind of talk her down, and she's very on edge. The firefighters, they're getting close too, and it's just kind of this tense moment. As the elder police officer, he turns his head to tell the firefighters to back away, but as he's starting to say this, the old lady pounces and she bites a huge chunk out of his shoulder. At this point, chaos ensues. The older lady kind of gets away, and then they grab the elder police officer and they're trying to rush him downstairs. They finally get to the main lobby carrying the police officer bleeding out, but they can't get out the doors because outside they are quarantining the building. They're blocking off all of the exits. It makes it a pretty appropriate name for the American remake film, I guess, once you kind of see this happening. Once they see the exits are being blocked off, everyone gets pretty furious. The residents, the police officer, the firefighters, and Angela. Angela then looks at Pablo and she orders him, film everything. We need to film everything. We need to film what's going on. People are talking, they're mad, it's kind of chaos going on. And then all of a sudden, if you didn't notice, Alex is missing from the group that rushed the police officer downstairs. While everyone's yelling and screaming, all of a sudden you hear him yelling and he comes falling down the flight of stairs and smacks into the concrete. One of the bits of the behind the scenes I read was that whenever he fell down the flight of stairs, and it sounded like a pretty high fall, that none of the actors or actresses knew that that scene was coming, so they were telling them to talk, act angry that they're being quarantined, and then they just threw the firefighter's body all the way down and smack, and then everyone reacted to it. The reactions are genuine. Now, during this movie, the young officer, the only officer left in the building, he repeatedly tells Pablo to turn off the camera, quit filming, and sometimes he gets a little physical and tries to shove down the camera. But you gotta give Angela credit. Every time he comes near Pablo, she fires right back and she screams, "Don't touch the camera, leave him alone." And I'm just saying, if I were to be a cameraman, I would want Angela to be my reporter. No one will do you wrong and live to tell about it if Angela is your partner. Now we get to the point to where a scream is heard upstairs, and then our main actors that we've been following, they decide to go upstairs and see what the screaming is. I mean, they can't get out. What else are they going to do? They get to this hallway upstairs, and Pablo, for some reason, decides to get brave, and he starts shuffling down the hallway towards this room, and Angela's going, "Pablo, what are you doing?" And I'm asking the same thing, all he has is a camera, but he's shuffling towards this room because I don't know why. But eventually a lady explodes out, and it looks like she's dying, and then the old lady from before comes out of the room. Pablo backpedals as he sees the old lady, and the young officer steps up. The old lady pauses for a second and then charges him, and the officer open fires and the old lady goes down. After he shoots her, you can tell the police officer is a little disturbed by it. He looks at Manuel and he says, you saw her lunge at me, you saw her come at me. And he goes, "Yeah, I know, man, I saw it. And then they kind of move on with the scene. You could tell the police officer's getting a little emotionally fatigued by this whole situation. Everyone goes back down to the lobby and they start discussing their different options, and one of the people or residents says that he knows of different exits in the building. The police officer then steps up and goes, "No, we have strict orders that everyone stays in the lobby." They then kind of argue with him and they're like, "No, we're trapped in here. We need to get a way out. We got 2 people in here basically dead. We need to find a way out of here." And they ignore the cop and they start looking for different exits. Again, the police officer is stressed. They look one way, that exit's blocked off. A tidbit of information while they're standing there. So there's a mom who's holding a little girl in her arms, and the mom keeps freaking out, saying that she's trying to get a hold of her husband. He's outside and she can't get a response from him. And then she says that the little girl is sick. No one really reacts to this, but I mean, deep down you're watching a zombie slash movie that, that kind of gives you the uh-oh type reaction. They attempt one more exit, and again it is blocked off. The police officer who keeps trying to get them down to the lobby, he ends up pulling a gun on them. They all kind of pause. Again, Manuel, he steps up and he talks the police officer down. The police officer apologizes and he's saying he's just trying to do his job. They then eventually go down to the lobby again. While they are in the lobby, the SWAT force quarantining the building, they announce that they need to stay patient. They are sending a health inspector into the building, and they say it is a BNC quarantine. They stated in the movie what BNC was. I remember it was biological threats, nuclear threats, and the C was chemical threats, I believe it was. Again, all the residents start to panic, then the camera kind of cuts out, and then it snaps back into 2 in the morning. It's at this point in the film to where Angela interviews some of the residents, and then you find out who they are. There's Golem, who is an intern. He's given shots to the people who are bitten. He seems like an overall nice guy. He's saying he has a lot of keys to the apartment and he kind of runs the place. There's an elder couple who, when Angela is interviewing them, the elder lady starts to talk about the BNC quarantine and how this is something major, to where the elder man then kind of cuts her off and kind of gives the "can I talk" bit, but then he kind of tells Angela that they don't know what's going on, and if they did, they would have said it by now. There's an Asian family. There's a woman, her husband, I'm guessing, and it looks like a child. Angela's interviewing the woman in the family, and she seems very confused by everything that has just happened. Angela then interviews the little sick girl while her mom stands by the side. Angela asks her if she's feeling very sick, and she said yes. The little girl says her dad's outside. She misses him. And then Angela asks the little girl, are there any other family members? And the little girl says, well, my dog Max. And Angela says, well, where's your dog Max? And she goes, well, he's in the vet. He wasn't doing so good. Again, it kind of gives you the, oh no. Angela's last interview is with a guy named Caesar, who at first seems very nice, but then he goes off on a tangent on how Chinese people, they eat everything raw. They leave their door open all the time, and that is very weird, and he doesn't trust them, and they're just always yelling Japanese, which, by the way, one of the directors of this film, of Wreck, I read a fact that he said growing up he had Asian neighbors, and one thing they always did was leave their door open, and he found that very interesting. So I think part of that moment in his life made it into the script of this character Caesar. Finally, after all of these interviews, the health inspector finally enters the apartment in a hazmat suit, and of course the only thing he says once he comes in is, why is a camera crew here? One of the directors, when he talked about what inspired him to make the movie Wreck, I do know he pays lip service to the Blair Witch Project and other found footage movies, but I know another thing he said was reality TV, and how everything you see on the camera is what represents the truth. And I've kind of wondered if the police and the health inspector, their first questions are, why is the camera crew here? Maybe that's kind of a reflection on that thought or belief, just something I thought of. The next bit is the health inspector going into the room with the 2 bitten individuals, the police officer and Alex, and he starts giving them shots. While he's giving them shots, one of them comes alive. They start attacking the guy in the hazmat suit. They do not bite him, but they do bite Golem. Everyone in that room evacuates the room except Guillaume. They lock him in there. Angela's asking why are they locking him in there. They said he was bitten, he's infected, and they can't let him out for their own safety. They're asking what he means, and then he goes, oh, I can't explain, and then the infected start to break through the window, so then they gotta run for safety. Big metal gate that they shut for the moment, which kind of gives you the appearance that they are safe in the lobby area. Once they are there, everyone kind of corners the health inspector and they start to demand answers. The health inspector starts to say that he's obligated to not share any information, but the people aren't buying it, they're not letting him go. So finally he starts to spill the beans. The health inspector explains that the day before they got a call from the vet. There was a dog that was sick. It went into a coma, but then the dog woke up and it was very aggressive. They end up tracing that dog, and that dog's location of the owners was in that apartment. Angela then pipes in and says, "Was that dog's name Max?" And the guy replied, "Yes." The camera then does a slow pan to the sick little girl and her mom. The mom's response is, "It's just tonsillitis," and everyone's trying to talk her down and explain to her that things are about to go bad, but before they can convince her, the little girl bites her mom's face. The little girl then rages out and runs upstairs, and to make matters worse for the mom, they then handcuff her to the stairway. Manu and the cop then pursue the girl upstairs. Of course, Pablo follows so we can see all the carnage that's about to happen. They find the little girl standing in the room, and her eyes look like a darkish reddish color. It was a really cool shot of the little girl. She looks demonic, basically. The cop approaches her, and the little girl lunges, and she bites a chunk out of his shoulder. So he is now bitten and infected. He then looks at Manuel and Pablo and tells them to get out of there. They listen and start to go down the hall, but then the old lady from the beginning of the film pops out. But Manuel was ready, and he pulls out a sledgehammer, and he takes care of her. Manuel and Pablo start to run downstairs because the infected are upstairs, but the residents are running upstairs the opposite way. It turns out that metal gate was not locked, and the infected are trying to get through, and there's only about 3 people trying to hold the metal gate down. Since they don't have the key, they decide to run upstairs and no longer try to hold the metal gate down. The infected break through the metal gate, and then they take care of the mom who is handcuffed to the stairway. Manuel, Pablo, and Angela, they pause for a moment to try to recollect themselves, and they notice the health inspector is gone. They go down this hallway that has a flimsy door blocking it. The health inspector's there. They start to yell at him about what's going on. He just kind of gives them a, "Hey, I've been bitten, get out of here, get lost." Anytime they try to reason with him or accuse him of anything, he just kind of gives them the same old, "No, I'm bitten, get out of here, get lost, don't be stupid, get out of here." The health inspector closes the flimsy door and locks it. He kind of dies a heroic death trying to save everyone left in the apartment and so that he doesn't attack anyone. Caesar then chimes in and says there's an upper apartment level that is safe, it's closed off, no one should be up there if they can just get the key, which is in Guillaume's room. As he's explaining this tidbit of information, he's kind of backing up. He goes by the flimsy door, and of course, the health inspector reaches through the door and bites him, and he's done. All of this carnage doesn't let up through all the scenes here. As they are trying to get to the room with the key, Manuel has a sledgehammer, and he's taking care of zombies left and right. The Asian man, who's now a zombie, runs up the stairway. Manuel puts him in a headlock, basically, then calls Pablo over, and they snap his neck. All of the lights then go out, and you can't see a thing. They tell Pablo to turn on his brights with the camera. Pablo does, and as soon as the brights turn on, the Asian lady is right there in the camera attacking them. Manuel decides to pull an MC Hammer, and he takes care of her with the sledgehammer. Finally, they get to the room they're supposed to be at. They search around. Angela finds a lanyard with 1,000 keys attached to it, basically. One of them yells out, "Which one is it?" And Angela says, "Well, we'll take them all." I'm sure that won't lead to a suspenseful moment. They fight their way to the top of the apartment to where the closed off section is. Unfortunately, Manu doesn't make it along the way. A big suspenseful moment happens where they get to the door and Angela can't find the right key to get in. Pablo leans over the edge, looks down the staircase, and they do a really cool shot of the stairs are slightly lit up, but you just see all the residents that live there are now zombies and they are charging up the stairs full speed. Angela finally finds the right key and they get in just in time and slam the door in a zombie's face. This final room that they're in, this is where they kind of give you the lowdown of all the lore of the film. There's posters everywhere of this girl, and then there's a poster that says something along the lines of a Portuguese girl was possessed. Angela is stammering, "What does that mean? What does that mean?" And then they find a tape recorder. When they press play, it kind of gives a mad scientist vibes. It's a guy who's talking about how he wants to fix a virus with a vaccine. By virus, he means the possessed girl. Then they fast forward to the tape, and then he says the virus unexpectedly mutated and is resistant to the vaccine. The guy then says the girl must be rid of, and there must be no trace of her. As Angelo and Pablo are wandering the room as the recorder's playing, the guy states that he has sealed the girl inside the room and that no one should be able to get in, which is the very room that they are wandering around about. At this point, the attic door swings open, and Pablo decides it's a good idea to stick his camera up in the attic and see what's up there. And it slowly pans around the attic, and then finally a jump scare happens to where there's a little kid living in the attic, and he swings at the camera and breaks the light. Since the light is broken, he has to turn night vision on the camera. Now, during this scene, the actress and actor who played these parts, they really couldn't see in the dark. They wanted it to be an authentic performance, but lurking around in that room is a gigantic, gross looking troll-like lady. I don't even really know the accurate words to describe her. Ghoul lady is wandering around. She can't see, and Pablo says if she can't hear us, then she can't find us. So then they start to try to walk around her. Of course, Pablo kicks something over. The ghoul lady then attacks Pablo and drops the camera. Angela then picks up the camera, sees the ghoul lady eating Pablo. The ghoul lady then knocks Angela over again to where the camera is pointing right in Angela's face. And she's breathing for a second, looking around, starting to crawl, and then she gets dragged away. And that is the end of the movie. One thing I thought that was disappointing of Rec and Quarantine is that the final image or shot of Angela being dragged away, whether it be in Rec or Quarantine, because both happened, was that in the advertisements for the movie, they show her getting dragged away. In the cover of the movie, they show her getting dragged away. Basically, any chance in marketing they had to show Angela getting dragged away, they did. So they gave away the ending, which is kind of a disappointment. They should have left that in the dark more. Now, I said in the beginning that there was a few subtle differences between these two different movies. The biggest difference, and I think it comes to everyone's mind, is really what is the cause of this disease that happens in this apartment. In Rec, it is basically a possession virus, to where if anyone gets bitten by someone who's infected, they then become infected, but they're infected because they are possessed by a demon type entity. Quarantine went the route of that this virus is basically human rabies. When you get bit, it acts just like rabies, and then you become super aggressive, and then you just want to kill everything in sight. By choosing to go to the human rabies route, Quarantine really couldn't make a sequel like Rec 2. In Rec 2, a main focus of its plot revolves around the possession virus. So with Quarantine discarding that element of the plot and inserting the human rabies, they couldn't do what Rec 2 did. And on paper, a possession virus might seem kind of dumb or silly or stupid, but Rec 2 honestly knocked it out of the park. It is an awesome sequel. Quarantine 2, not so much. Just that really small detail in the plot of how the virus got started, it made the two franchises, if you want to call them, go in different directions as the next movies went. Some people might say that's a good thing that Quarantine didn't copy Rec 2. I say it's a very bad thing. They should have just kept doing what they did, and they should have just did what Rec 2 did, because Rec 2 did it the best way possible, in my opinion. The difference between the two films is the technique in which they filmed. The actors and actresses, like I stated before, they didn't know what was going to happen next in Rec, to a degree, and at least that's what they say. I mean, it's the chaotic scenes, I imagine it's kind of hard to do all of that on the fly. Filming Quarantine, since it was a shot-for-shot remake, basically, the actors and actresses knew what was going to happen ahead of the time. The actress, Jennifer Carpenter, who played the main female, Angela the reporter, who she was actually in the show Dexter, as Deborah, but when it came time to do the attic scene with the little kid in it, she asked the director not to show her the little kid so she would be a little more surprised when acting out that scene. So she knew it was coming, but I mean, she still tried to authentically act by not looking at what was coming in the incoming scenes. Speaking of filming, one more tidbit that I wanted to throw in there before I get to my final difference is I found it interesting in Quarantine they actually shot the film in chronological order, which is a pretty rare thing when it comes to filming movies. A lot of times films they film in order into which they have access to the actors or actresses in specific locations. So in most films they are filmed out of order, not in chronological order. I didn't see anything about Rec doing that, but I know Quarantine did. One more subtle difference that I want to talk about, and it is very subtle, is when you watch Rec, you have to kind of wonder, how did the dog and the old lady get infected with this virus when it started with the Portuguese girl who was possessed in the very top layer of the apartment, which is sealed off from everyone else? How did that virus get to the other people in the apartment? And you don't really get an answer. In Quarantine, I think they tried answering this by a very subtle scene, I guess you could call it subtle, to where is the cameraman in Quarantine, he's walking and he's looking down at the ground, and there is a rat, and the rat goes right for him, and he stomps out the rat, and he's like, oh my gosh, and everyone's like, what? And he's like, that rat was coming right for me, it was really aggressive. And I think that was Quarantine's way of saying, well, the way our virus got out was because of the rats in the apartment. That's how they got the dog, and that's how they got the old lady. It's because of the rats. So again, it's a very subtle difference, but at least Quarantine tries to answer that question, to where as Rec, if you sit there and try to ponder on it, they don't really give an explanation, you just kind of accept it. Speaking of the cameraman, before I go, I did notice in Quarantine you do see the cameraman. He will set down the camera, he will walk out in front of it, he will talk to Angela. In Rec, you never see the cameraman. The most you see is his heel. He sets down the camera, he walks in front of it, but all you see is his Nike shoe. I don't know if they're Nike, but that's all you really see of him. And I kind of like that aspect in Rec, because I think in found footage movies, a cool thing about them is you feel immersed in the action as if you are the person that is holding the camera, that is your point of view in the movie. And in Rec, when you don't see the camera person, you can kind of envision yourself being that camera person in a way, to whereas Quarantine, they show the camera person and you know he's just another person in the film. So I guess that's the final difference between the two films, at least that I could find. Well, that's my breakdown of Quarantine and Rec. If you haven't seen Quarantine or Rec, I would recommend them. If you've seen Quarantine and not Rec, I would recommend watching Rec, because that's what it's based off of. If you've watched Rec, I recommend watching Quarantine, because it's basically the same film but with a higher budget, and I think it holds its own weight. If you've seen Quarantine and you are curious about Rec 2, I would highly recommend it. Even if you haven't seen Rec, you've seen Quarantine, which is the same story, you know what happens, and it's a continuation of that story, unlike Quarantine 2. And Rec 2 is very good, unlike Quarantine 2. I know, I'm hating on Quarantine 2. So what do you think of Rec and Quarantine? Am I wrong for saying Quarantine's a better film? I'm sure there's lots of people that think so. Feel free to email me your thoughts at feelthescreams123@gmail.com. It's been fun talking about these movies, and I'll catch you guys next time. Thank you for listening to Feel the Screams.